We knew that smallpox existed, that it could be used as a bioterrorism weapon. And I had been trying for a long time to get people to be proactive in this, to be creating more vaccine, to establish a workbook of exactly what we should be doing should something like this happen. It wasn't until the anthrax attacks that people took me seriously.
Everybody lost somebody. There wasn't anybody that I knew of who had heard of who hadn't lost friends, family. It was a global grieving. This was every single human being on the planet who was affected by this horrific illness. And we hadn't got over it. Because we're still living in fear.
We used to believe that the greatest threat to the United States were the nuclear arsenals of a rogue state. But in this world today, a terrorist with the will to sacrifice his own life, armed only with a penknife and a pilot's license, is capable of anything. The greatest threat, as we now know, to our lives and security is a single individual with a $50 chemistry set and the will to decimate the planet.
In 2002, 60 million people worldwide were killed by a disease no one had seen for over 20 years. It was the greatest act of mass murder in history. In the 20th century, smallpox killed more people than all the century's wars combined. It is one of the most contagious airborne viruses known to man. A third of those who contract the disease die. In 1962, the World Health Organization launched a vaccination campaign to rid the world of smallpox forever. By 1980, they had succeeded. Vaccination stopped. The only living samples of the virus were safely locked inside 2 maximum security laboratories, one in Russia and one in the United States. Or so the world believed.
Dr. Brown, 1961, Dr. Brown, 1961.
Pretty standard day in the ER. You had trauma victims, drunks, asthmatics. There's also a mild flu epidemic going on in the city at that time. So when Cynthia came into the ER and was complaining of a fever, it was pretty standard. It wasn't anything out of the ordinary.
29-year-old sales assistant Cynthia Sheldon had been feeling unwell for 24 hours. She brought herself to Long Island College Hospital, where she was treated by Dr. Carl Jocelyn.
She had a high fever, but nothing that was too alarming. She was complaining of headache, back pain. She had a mild rash at that time on her hands. Just kind of red. But it wasn't anything that I considered to be outside of symptomatic of the flu.
A routine anthrax test on Cynthia came back negative.
So I did what any other doctor would have done. Gave her some Tylenol, told her to drink plenty of fluids and get plenty of rest. If anything had gone wrong, come back in a couple of days and we check her out. She went home.
For the previous 6 months, the Department of Health had been on heightened alert for any unusual outbreaks of disease. Dr. Sam Wiseman was the head of New York's bioterrorism unit.
We're very proud of our surveillance system here in New York City. We are always looking to find trends in illness. We have a very sophisticated monitoring system. We monitor 911 calls, hospital discharges, pharmacy orders, even the city morgue. We can tell you if there's a run on aspirin. But on April 11th, we had nothing, not a clue, to suggest the enormity of what was about to happen.
At 6:20 that evening, Cynthia Sheldon was brought back to Long Island College Hospital.
Her state had deteriorated greatly. Fever was very high, and the rash that she had before on her hands had spread over her body and had erupted into these small pus-filled blisters that were all up and down her arms and on her face. When I examined her further, I found that the blisters were all over, up and down her torso, on her neck, down the inside of her throat. It obviously wasn't the flu, but I didn't know exactly what it was, only that it looked highly infectious.
It's still not clear why Long Island College Hospital in Brooklyn has sealed off its emergency room. There's some speculation that this could be another bioterrorist scare. And in the past hour, we've seen people entering the hospital in protective clothing.
My cell phone went off, and it was the infectious disease doctor from Long Island College Hospital who was calling. And he said they had a young woman in their isolation unit, and would I come down and take a look at her?
Earlier, we saw Dr. Sam Wiseman, epidemiologist for the New York City Department of Health, but he refused to make any comment.
What I saw when I went in was a woman who was delirious. Her face was swollen, probably beyond recognition for those who knew her. Her eyes were shut and tearing, and she was not alert. I can't describe to you the fear that I felt. It was overwhelming.
Sam Wiseman was convinced he was looking at a case of smallpox. His first priority was to establish how widespread this outbreak might be. The Department of Health immediately faxed every hospital in the 5 boroughs of the city, requesting information on any patients that might be showing early symptoms of the disease.
Within a half an hour, we were hearing about possible cases in 4 of the 5 boroughs. But worse than that, 15 of the hospitals that we heard from had not only seen such cases in the last 48 hours, but had sent them home, just the way Cynthia had been sent home. And I said, my God, there are all these people out there spreading this disease in a geometric fashion. One person infects 20, 20 infects another 20, and so on and so forth.
And they won't even know that they're infected until they become sick, 10 to 12 days later, at which point they're infectious.
By 10 o'clock that night, over 30 suspected cases of smallpox had been identified. It would take 24 hours before the disease could be confirmed by laboratory diagnosis, but a plan of action was needed. The mayor called a crisis meeting at the Office of Emergency Management. Present were Dr. Richard Benson from the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta, Kathleen O'Reilly, head of the New York office of the FBI, and Jack Hill, head of the Office of Emergency Management.
I said we had to contain the virus and keep it from spreading, which meant that we had to mobilize the National Guard. We had to close down the airports, the train stations, to restrict movement of anybody in and out of the city, that we had to vaccinate anybody that had been exposed to the virus, and we had to quarantine anybody who had contracted smallpox. That's basically what we're talking about.
What we had was a handful of unconfirmed smallpox cases. No one had died, and we didn't even know if we were dealing with smallpox at all. What Jack wanted to do was to shut the whole city down, and that would do nothing but create panic. And what we had learned from the anthrax crisis was the last thing you need to do in a medical emergency is to have any kind of panic. The hospitals get overcrowded, the ambulances can't get to the hospitals, the streets are jammed with people trying to flee the city. No, I told Jack at the time I did not think that was an option.
Overreaction provokes panic. And at that time, we didn't know what we were dealing with. Was it a deliberate release, or was it an accident from a lab? Was it confined to New York, or would we find cases popping up all over the United States? How many people were infected? We needed a clear and measured response to keep the public on side.
I felt the overreaction was appropriate. I didn't think it was an overreaction, but I thought it was appropriate. They didn't, and they succeeded, and I didn't.
In the past few hours, we have received reports from a number of New York hospitals of a possible outbreak of an infectious disease.
As a precaution, it was agreed that anyone who had been in direct contact with the suspected case should be vaccinated.
In the meantime, we are taking...
No further action was deemed necessary at that stage.
There is absolutely no need for alarm. The situation is being closely monitored, and the public will be updated as soon as we have anything new to report.
Mr. Mayor,
Yes, Beth?
is this an act of bioterrorism?
At this stage...
4,000 miles away in Geneva, the World Health Organization was checking for any smallpox outbreaks elsewhere in the world. None had been reported, but Dr. Pierre Lefebvre, the WHO's head of communicable diseases, feared that this situation could not last.
I know about smallpox. I worked on the eradication program, and I knew that for a virus like that, New York City was absolutely perfect for the spread of it. It was a big city, high-density population, and, you know, they had everywhere for the virus to live. You could live in ventilation shafts, elevators, you know, office blocks, subways, shopping malls. Cool and dry places where the virus could live airborne for 24 hours, you see. And then it could spread. Nobody had been vaccinated for over 20 years. Any protection would have worn off by then. So the planet was a virgin territory for the virus. And that was very frightening indeed. Because you have 200,000 people a day using New York airports, and some are, you know, internal flights, but a large number are international. And if the virus got out of New York, then it could travel all over the world with impunity, really.
But by the time New York had diagnosed its first case, it was already too late. The virus had moved on.
We were coming up to our first anniversary. Mark had just been promoted again, which was great news because it meant that he had more autonomy in what he did, and he wasn't going to have to travel so much. We had decided we were going to try for a baby. The timing was right. We were feeling pretty smug about things. It was all going very, very well.
2 days before Cynthia Sheldon first went to hospital, New York businessman Mark Smits was preparing to leave for an urgent business appointment in London.
Before he left, he was feeling pretty ropey. He came home and spent a couple of hours just in bed, just crashed out. Said he had a headache and he was tired, and naturally I wanted to fuss over him, but he didn't really like that, so okay, just leave him be. And I took him to the airport. I kissed him goodbye, and he left.
At 10:30 a.m. on April the 8th, Mark Smits checked into his hotel in central London. When he arrived, he complained of a high fever, and the hotel doctor was called. The doctor diagnosed flu and said he would check on him the next morning. By 11:30 a.m. the following day, Smits' condition had deteriorated dramatically. He was immediately transferred to St. Mary's Hospital in Paddington.
When I first set eyes on Mark Smith, it was absolutely unbelievable that he was even alive. I mean, his body had completely turned black. There were open wounds, bleeding all across the skin. His eyes were bleeding. And in that condition, it was even hard to use an IV on him. The only thing I could do to make him comfortable was to give him gas, and that was it.
We clearly had a public health emergency here. His symptoms were closest to those we knew for Ebola and Marburg fever, highly contagious, deadly diseases, hemorrhagic diseases. But at the time, there was no question of it being smallpox.
The Kingsway Hall Hotel was isolated and decontaminated. Anyone Smits had been in direct physical contact with was quarantined, and an investigation began to trace Smits' exact movements over the past few days. The trail quickly led back to his home in New York.
4 men from the New York Health Department knocked on my door. They were dressed in the contamination suits, the white contamination suits, and they all had gas masks on. They sat me down and said that a man they believed to be Mark Smits had been taken from a London hotel to a hospital, and from there to an isolation ward with a suspected contagious virus. They didn't know what it was. They were still doing tests, but they were concerned for my health. And I thought, well, okay, naturally I want to be with him. And I said, can you arrange flights? Can I go there? Can I go to London? Can I be with him? At which point they said that there was no point because the patient in question had died the day before.
In London, the disease that had killed Mark Smits had still not been diagnosed.
Late that night, in fact in the early hours of the morning, Farah and I were working together on the measures that had to be put in place to find the Ebola contacts, as we thought they would be then, on Mark Smits' journey from Heathrow Airport to his hotel.
And I remember the television was on, and there was a news bulletin from CNN in New York.
And up flashed a story about possible smallpox in New York. Frankly, at that time, I didn't connect this to our patient at all.
And it was then that I remembered some nightmare stories that my father had told me, in fact, about India and Pakistan when he was a kid, where during a smallpox epidemic, there were people dying from what they call the black pox.
It's the same disease, but in about 3% of cases, you have this hemorrhagic variation where the body is blackened, swells, and the victim inevitably bleeds to death from internal hemorrhages.
The whole scale of it had changed, because with Ebola you were talking about direct contact for it to spread. But you know, smallpox is an airborne disease.
Now we were out to find anyone who had breathed the same air as Mark Smith during that day. It is on the whole journey from Heathrow, from the aeroplane, through immigration control, baggage, on Heathrow Express, a train, through Paddington Station, the taxi rank, all the taxis that had been to Paddington and to his hotel, the staff and the guests. It's a huge number of people.
To contain the virus, the authorities had to locate everyone at risk, vaccinate them within 4 days of exposure, and persuade them to stay at home for 17 days, the maximum incubation period of the disease. But Cynthia and Mark were just the tip of the iceberg.
CDC in Atlanta have confirmed that the New York outbreak is smallpox. This begs more questions.
Within 24 hours, 38 new cases were confirmed in New York, plus 6 further cases in 3 other countries.
New York City is reeling this morning after confirmation of an outbreak of smallpox. People on the streets are taking whatever precautions they can, but the mood of New Yorkers is clearly fearful.
First it was anthrax, now this. I don't know what's going on. I'm scared. I'm scared for my family. I'm scared for my friends.
Did a lot of people not show up to work today?
Yeah, a lot of people are afraid, not coming in, not showing up, and it's kind of crazy.
In other parts of the city, worried parents have been taking their children out of school. How worried are you about your daughter?
Why should I put my children at risk? I'm very concerned about my children's health and safety.
Do you feel you're getting enough information about the epidemic?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not.
As the anxiety of New Yorkers grew, the city's hospitals were becoming overwhelmed.
It was chaotic. The worried well came out in droves. You had to deal with those people who didn't have smallpox, but just had a flu. And it was a big guessing game in terms of who was what. And then once you decided who did have smallpox, well, where were you going to put them? There was only so many negative pressure rooms that we had and isolation wards until things started to fill up. And it was difficult because for us, we had a limited amount of vaccine at our disposal.
Well, the irony is that we had ordered enough vaccine after September the 11th to vaccinate every man, woman, and child in the United States, but that was not due for delivery until the end of 2002. Now, we had some test batches which were not proven in their efficacy, and we could push delivery as fast as we possibly could, but even then we would not be getting the quantities of vaccine that we needed for several weeks. And so we had to use our existing stockpile of vaccine, which was at best 15 million doses, as wisely as we possibly could.
Just put some solution on your skin.
So we had to make every dose count. We had to focus the use of this vaccine on people who were most at risk. That meant hospital workers, and paramedics, and only those contacts that had a face-to-face contact with a known case. No friends, no relatives, even the epidemiologists on my staff didn't get vaccine unless they had been face-to-face with a case.
But Jack Hill believed holding back vaccine was a mistake, and that mass vaccination of New York should begin immediately.
To not vaccinate the city means that you would have a lot of people very pissed off about the fact that they weren't being protected. And this means the bus drivers, the subway drivers, the ambulance drivers, anybody that supports the infrastructure of the city. If they're not vaccinated, how are they going to know that they're safe to do their job? How are they going to know that their family is safe when they come home? So it's not a matter of just medical necessity, it's human necessity.
But the CDC would not authorize a wider vaccination program in New York. Their fear was that the epidemic had been started deliberately. No one knew which city might be targeted next.
From the moment Jack Hill phoned, we suspected that it was a deliberate release. And as soon as we had established that there were no reports of an accident in a lab, I had no doubt in my mind that the city was under attack.
My fellow Americans, we have reason to believe that the outbreak of smallpox in New York is an act of terrorism on the American people. The highest priority of this administration is to find and prosecute these criminals and prevent any further outbreaks. Have no doubt, the full force of retribution will be brought to bear on the perpetrators of this evil crime and its sponsors. God bless America.
Well, the obvious place to point the finger is the Middle East, of course. I mean, we already believed that there were several organizations that had access to biological weapons. And the obvious conclusion is that this was a step up in escalation between us and our known enemies. But then you have to set back. You have to look again, because Islam does not have the monopoly on fanaticism. Look at the group in Japan, the release of sarin gas in the Tokyo subways of 1995. Look at our very own dear Timothy McVeigh. I mean, we couldn't rule out anybody.
But 3 days after the first case was diagnosed, there were still no clues as to who had unleashed the virus or why.
And the American public simply weren't going to stand for us not solving this one.
Is it definitely smallpox? How many deaths are there? Can you please tell us how?
Everybody wanted fast answers. But this investigation was unlike any other we'd encountered.
I'm unable to make a comment at this time, except to say that a full-scale investigation is underway, and as soon as we have anything conclusive to report, a public statement will be made. Thank you.
No one had claimed responsibility. There were no suspects, no witnesses, no motive, no scene of crime, just victims.
There was no common thread that tied the early cases together. They were all over the city, different occupations, different sexes, different ages, all of the epidemiologic features that we look at usually. There was nothing. What we needed to do was to track the movements of all of the initial patients, at least for the previous 2 weeks, the incubation period of the disease. And that was very difficult to do. Many of these people were sick, and it's very hard to remember such movements when you're sick. It's hard enough when you're well. I mean, for example, do you remember what you ate for lunch a week ago Thursday? It's very hard.
What's that? What's her name?
But on day 4, the investigation made its first breakthrough. The CDC in Atlanta identified the strain of smallpox as India 1.
This proved that the virus originated in a Russian bioweapons lab and then somehow found its way into the hands of terrorists.
In the 1960s, the Soviet Union was one of the driving nations behind the campaign to eradicate smallpox. But this was at the height of the Cold War. Unwittingly, many of the Soviet doctors were sending smallpox samples back to the Russian military. To the generals, the eradication of the disease presented a unique opportunity.
If there is no smallpox, it means nobody would be vaccinated anymore. If nobody is vaccinated, a new biological weapon based on smallpox would be the most powerful and effective weapon ever created to eliminate human life.
In the 1980s, Dr. Ken Alabek held the rank of colonel in the Soviet army. His job, to oversee the secret development of a massive bioweapons program using a specially selected strain of smallpox.
The major strain used in the Soviet Union had a code name India 1. It was a highly virulent, highly contagious agent, and it was not very difficult to adopt this strain for existing technological processes.
Although it was consistently denied to the West, Biopreparat, the Soviet biological weapons program, was producing deadly diseases on an industrial scale. Inside these laboratories, Ebola, tularemia, anthrax, and smallpox were all weaponized. They were then loaded into missiles to be unleashed on the West in the event of total war.
We call biological weapons weapons of mass destruction. It's a very significant mistake. Biological weapons are not weapons of mass destruction. Biological weapons are mass casualty weapons. Biological weapons don't destroy non-living entities. They just infect and kill people.
It wasn't until 1992, when Ken Alabek defected to America, that the full scale of the Soviet biological weapons program became apparent.
The size and scope of the research and development program was enormous. Upwards of 60,000 people worked in Biopreparat alone. Large numbers of experts in every aspect of the biological sciences and microbiology and the like. Almost really the flower of a generation of the most clever people, in some instances, ended up in the program.
In the 80s and 90s, hundreds of tons of smallpox were stockpiled in Soviet laboratories. Real concerns existed over the security of these facilities.
With the breakup of the Soviet Union, the support to the laboratories where the virus was being made diminished sharply, and between a third and a half of all the scientists left the laboratories to go to many places. And let us face it, these are scientists with families and what have you, and no money. And so you could certainly hire these people as consultants very easily at very low prices, and many countries did.
The fear was that samples of the virus had traveled with them.
There are many, in my opinion, non-official stocks of smallpox virus.
By day 7 of the epidemic in New York, the number of smallpox cases had stabilized at 62. But that was all about to change. The epidemic was moving into its next phase.
In overstretched hospitals around the capital, Delhi, medical staff say the number of confirmed cases has risen from 2 to 18.
By April the 18th, new outbreaks were confirmed in the densely populated cities of Delhi, Tokyo, Karachi, and Moscow.
Meanwhile, Bangladesh is one of a growing...
Other nations took action to try to prevent the further spread of the disease to their shores.
Passengers arriving from Calcutta were stopped at Dhaka Airport.
French nationals are still being allowed off ships, they face a possible 17-day quarantine. And as from tomorrow, all Eurotunnel and ferry services between France and England will be suspended until the epidemic in the UK.
In London, the authorities were also beginning to count the cost of Mark Smith's legacy.
We vaccinated more than 4,000, and still it slipped through the nets. It's an elusive disease.
In just 4 days, between April the 18th and the 21st, London saw nearly 100 new cases.
It was just multiplying. The kind of cases that we were coming up against, you could not predict. We found cases of people who'd used the toilet in Paddington 5 hours after Mark Smiths had been there. And then there was this Filipino woman. She'd been moonlighting for a friend and was cleaning at the hotel where Mark Smiths had stayed. You know, the closest she came to him was 3 floors above. But the rooms shared an air conditioning system, and the virus survived, and, you know, just... I mean, it literally, it'll find a place and it'll find a victim.
As the United Kingdom's smallpox epidemic continues to escalate, hospitals throughout...
By day 11, outbreaks were confirmed in Glasgow, Manchester, Bristol and Birmingham.
Today, the Department of Health issued a special...
The UK was in the grip of a major nationwide epidemic.
...to those at risk of infection. Anyone suffering from the following symptoms, fever, cramps or any sign of skin rash is advised not to travel. They should stay at home and call the helpline, and medical support will be provided.
Command of the crisis in London was now in the hands of Chief Superintendent Clive McAdams.
At this stage, the Department of Health don't feel it's necessary to mass vaccinate. But I will say that as we speak, vaccination is going on.
A decision had been made to withhold information about the size of the UK vaccine stockpile.
Yes, sir?
Chief Superintendent, could you respond to recent rumours in the press that there's not enough vaccine in the country to contain the epidemic?
Now, we have a perfectly adequate stockpile of vaccine to contain and control this epidemic.
But can you confirm what the actual figure is?
I'm sure you'll appreciate that it's a matter of national security. I'm not at liberty to discuss the actual figure. Suffice to say that we have enough to meet all anticipated demands. There was roughly 14 million doses of vaccine. We weren't sure about that figure. That was the other thing. We weren't actually sure. It was a vague figure, but even so, 14 million vaccine. There are 60 million people in the UK. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to see that only a quarter of the UK are going to be vaccinated. And if that information had got out, it would have led to all-mass panic.
But by refusing to go public with the figures, it appeared the government had something to hide.
The press immediately became suspicious. They published inaccurate information. And just when we needed the public most, they started to disbelieve what we had to tell them. Once the public had seen those figures, there was a kind of domino effect of panic. And we lost control.
Despite the Department of Health's insistence that there's no significant risk to hauliers, the Transport and General Workers Union is supporting its drivers' demands for vaccine.
To me, it's pathetic, really, because we're driving all over the country and I haven't been vaccinated at all. And to be honest, I'm going back home now because I don't want to spread the disease around my area, around my family.
With almost no trucks delivering, panic buying led to food and fuel shortages. Within days, London transport workers joined the protest, refusing to work unless they too received vaccine.
You know, the epidemiologists couldn't get fuel for their cars. The environmental health workers who were my foot soldiers going around inoculating people couldn't get there. It was an absolute disaster.
With the UK's infrastructure unraveling, the authorities were rapidly losing their grip on the epidemic.
Well, it's May 1st, and as you see, there's a lot going on out there. There's an epidemic going on, and people are saying that it's going to get very, very big. So I'm at home, I'm doing nothing, I'm out of school. So I decided to keep a video diary of the point of view of me and my family, how it's going to affect us.
Hello.
Yeah, Mum.
Yes, what are you doing? Sean and Trish and I lived in a council flat.
Trisha? Morning, Trish.
In an estate in South London.
What are you doing on the computer, Mum?
I'm checking emails right now. I really did try to get Sean and Trish to stay indoors.
How are you today, Trish?
Piss off.
That's a good mood then.
Sean. All the news reports coming out were advising people to stay put, to try not to travel, etc. We had already decided that prior to the authorities giving this kind of blanket advice. It just seemed like the right thing to do.
What an effect of panic, everyone's buying stuff. Mum's no different. Very much looking forward to the lovely variation in beans on toast. What?
Sean, I think I just lost all my work.
What? How?
Paris
You know.
Shit.
Yeah, it's gone.
Oh, bloody hell.
What?
I can't be bothered, so you sure.
It's like the second time today.
Oh. We talked round in circles about what if we went to the country? What if we... there was nowhere that we could think of that was safe. There was absolutely nowhere.
This morning, Long Island College Hospital in Brooklyn announced that Cynthia Sheldon, America's first smallpox victim, has died.
Within the first 10 days, we went from 10 reported cases a day to 20 reported cases a day to 150 reported cases a day. You can't take 150 cases of reported smallpox a day and give it a good spin.
As fear turned to panic, tens of thousands of New Yorkers began to flee the city. But by now, outbreaks were occurring all over the USA. Suddenly, every state was clamoring for vaccine. There was only one solution: to dilute the existing stockpile.
We could dilute the vaccine 5 times. We could do that safely. Some people say up to 10 times, but we chose the 5 times figure because A, that's what we needed, and B, we wanted the vaccine to be as potent as possible. But it wasn't that simple.
You were lucky if you got 100 out of the vial that they gave you. If you don't hold the vial upright, if you hold it sideways, the drops that you get on the needle will be bigger and you'll be wasting doses. If you puncture the skin too abruptly or too deeply and you draw too much blood, you'll be washing away a vaccine. So then you have to do it again. So even though it says 100 on this vial, you know, you're lucky if you get half of 100.
You suffer from hepatitis A?
No.
Hepatitis B?
No.
Even where vaccine was available, for many it had serious side effects. Pregnant women, anyone with a chronic skin condition, or an immune deficiency disease like AIDS couldn't take the vaccine. In many cases, it could kill them. Sam Wiseman, who suffered from eczema, was among this group.
Well, there's a preparation called vaccinia immune globulin, or VIG, which is antibodies taken from the serum of people who have been vaccinated and given to people like me who can't take the vaccine. It's a very effective, if painful, series of intramuscular injections taken over 2 days. And there are only 700 courses of this available in the United States. And I must say I felt very awkward, at least, using it for myself when hundreds of thousands of others didn't have access to it. Or I could use it to protect my daughter, which is what I did.
On top of the lack of available treatment, the entire health system was at the point of collapse.
The city hospitals had 2 problems. One was the smallpox patients, which were overwhelming them, and the second was that the hospitals themselves couldn't deal with the daily routines that they needed to deal with. So we decided we had to create special hospitals. And we took the armories throughout the city and the boroughs, and we turned them into the smallpox hospitals.
Thousands of beds were set up inside each building in preparation for the anticipated cases. The hospitals were manned by volunteer health workers, and the National Guard was posted on the perimeter to prevent anyone getting out. By April 29th, 100 people had died. Each body was still infectious, making it impossible to return the victims to their families.
As the dead increased, it became apparent that we weren't going to be able to deal with it in the conventional manner in the city morgues. So we decided to take over Governor's Island and turn it into a morgue. and we took Army-issue air-conditioned tents, and every morning when the bodies were collected from the hospitals, they were taken to Governor's Island and laid out. And we filled one tent, and then we filled another tent, and then we filled another tent, and that's what we did with the dead.
As more and more people avoided coming into the city, the world's greatest financial district fell silent. In just over 2 weeks, New York had ground to a halt. By day 16, there were still no clues as to who had unleashed the virus. But the date of the attack had been pinpointed, April 1st, 2002.
A pattern started to emerge that was fairly clear. Amongst the early cases, there were two groups. The first group had traveled on the subway between Wall Street and Grand Central, between 7:30 and 8:30 in the morning. The second group were in or around Penn Station between 8:30 and 9:30. So clearly, and without a doubt, the killer had targeted these sections of the city.
You know, we pulled thousands of hours of CCTV footage from every bank, building, store, ATM machine in the target area. And I had 10 separate teams working 24 hours a day, scanning the footage frame by frame. But best of all, some of the survivors had described seeing an extremely ill man coughing on the subway.
2 hours ago, the FBI released a composite sketch of the suspected bioterrorist who infected New York City with smallpox. This likeness has been put together from witness descriptions of a man in his 30s.
The FBI today released a photo-fit image of their key suspect in the continuing investigation into the smallpox attack in the United States. As yet, no arrests have been made.
Witnesses say he was wearing a baseball cap, a casual blue zipped jacket, beige or grey trousers and trainers.
С американскими коллегами ищут ответственных за распространение эпидемии.
But as news of the suspect was broadcast, the next phase of infections began.
In the last 24 hours, 20 new countries have reported outbreaks of smallpox.
By the first day of May, over 30 countries were fighting outbreaks. International trade and transport slowed to a trickle.
And experts are predicting global economic meltdown.
In Istanbul today, police used water cannons to prevent...
Many nations without vaccine had to take harsh action to quell panic and contain the outbreaks. Every country was increasingly left to fend for itself. In London, life moved behind closed doors.
It's May 6th, and today we had our first outbreak. Yeah. Mr. Khan. Mr. Khan.
John Carling was a bus driver. You know, what point, when did he get sick? I suppose he caught the virus from one of the passengers. Who knows? It just looked really surreal, but also extremely frightening.
Sean!
There was a kind of mix of feelings that went with this. It was suddenly, okay, someone's become sick, and again you try to look at the most positive side of it. It's like, okay, we haven't been vaccinated. We know we need to be vaccinated. That's what's going to happen now, for sure. They're going to come and vaccinate everybody on the estate. What we learned very quickly was that they had vaccinated the immediate family, his wife, and the surrounding neighbours in a few of the flats. And that was it.
In the US, the number of cases was rising by 1,000 a day. Strict rationing of vaccine led to riots.
The predominantly African-American community of Compton in Los Angeles was reeling today after a night of violence.
The worst was in South Central Los Angeles, where 6 suspected cases were reported.
Of racial discrimination in its vaccination policy. Officials are withholding vaccine from the entire neighborhood, saying a suspected smallpox outbreak in the area remains unconfirmed.
The perception is that people in the halls of power in government are taking care of themselves, of vaccinating themselves, while we are being overlooked, being underserved, and being ignored, while we are facing a real health crisis. We cannot afford for the epidemic that we
You can't make one rule for one set of people and then another rule for another set of people. I want to make that very clear. There was no discrimination. There wouldn't have been any point in not vaccinating South Central Los Angeles. That's as good a breeding ground as anywhere else, as Boise, Idaho. Doesn't matter. It's the same people. It's an equal opportunity disease. So there was no discrimination, no.
But the public was hard to placate. As fear and panic took hold, random acts of violence broke out.
You had a populace that was basically paranoid. People were turning against each other. Neighbor was turning against neighbor. Community against community. You didn't know where the disease was going to come from. The guy down the hall, people who lived behind you, your own children. It was a time of panic, really, emotional panic, because people didn't know what to hold on to.
Sean! What? Sean, get here now. What?
But America wasn't the only place where people were turning their fear and suspicion on each other.
What? Look at that. That is absolutely... That makes me sick.
Oh my God.
Sean, come back.
Be 2 seconds. Yeah.
Some of the people in the state took the law into their own hands. It was like something from the Black Death or the plague or something. Red marks, people thought it was horrible.
Right, Mark, what's going on? Oh, yeah, I think they're boarding up people's house so we don't catch an infection.
Come back up, please. Stop filming, Sean, and come back upstairs now.
They boarded her windows and doors up. Bear in mind, this is a woman who'd been vaccinated already, that they would be better, safer if they just kind of locked her into her apartment.
It's definitely changed the mood. It's definitely hit closer to home now. You know, it's made people think that they don't know what's around the corner. They don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. Certainly not the next day. So the effect it's taking now.
By day 36, it was clear that the measures taken by the authorities to contain both the spread of the disease and public panic were failing. Draconian measures were needed. Armed troops enforced a curfew on the streets of London.
It's not ideal. In an ideal world, we believe in civil liberties, free movement of people. That's just what this disease wanted. Free movement of people. It's how it got here in the first place on an aeroplane. We had to combat the disease by restricting people's movements. It was inevitable. Reluctantly, I put my weight behind troops moving in to impose the quarantines.
In the face of widespread panic across the country, the British government today announced that new measures are being put in place to control and to contain the spread of the smallpox epidemic. Special quarantine centres are being set up around the country with the help of the army. A Department of Health spokesman said that only those at risk of having the disease would be moved to these centres, where they'll be vaccinated and monitored for possible symptoms.
With smallpox outbreaks in over 36 states, the American government was also forced to introduce harsh containment and quarantine measures.
Unfortunately, it seemed in some ways that we were bringing military means to bear on the people, the victims, if you like, of the disease. But that's a false picture. The target was always the disease.
By May 19th, the number of cases in the UK had risen to 13,000, and on the Cooper's estate, there was a second outbreak.
Who is it? Come on, who is it? Some guy in the front there. Hello.
Hello.
Hello? Yeah.
Are you Mary Cooper?
Yes, yeah.
My name's John Simpson from the Department of Health. Is this your daughter, Trish?
Yeah.
Just Sean.
Everything seemed to happen at once.
I've you come with me for quarantine.
I'm sorry, what?
We've opened quarantine centres now, and you have all been in close contact with a known smallpox case.
Oh my God.
You're going to have to come with us so you can be vaccinated.
They just started rattling off. The guy from the health organisation started telling us about how we had been exposed to a known smallpox case. We had to pack a bag. We had to leave in half an hour. It was just completely overwhelming.
Well, I'm not fucking going.
Trish, don't come back here now.
No, I'm not coming.
Trish!
No, I don't.
Well, why weren't we told this?
This is my bed.
Can't someone just come here and vaccinate us?
Your safety and the safety of your family.
Yeah, but we've been waiting for a long time now for vaccination. Why don't we get a vaccination before we're taken away somewhere else?
With anyone with confirmed case of smallpox.
I haven't let my family out, I haven't let them travel, and we haven't had vaccination. Now you want us to leave the building to go and get vaccination somewhere else?
What was I going to believe this guy? What was I going to do? Take my family to some quarantine with a guy standing with a gun outside our door?
Yeah, what your feet, mate? You alright, Mum?
I didn't really want to go.
Mum? Do you know where you're taking? Look, if it means getting a vaccine, it's all cool now. Huh? Then we'll be back here 17 days max. It'll be as it was. Just think of it like that.
I didn't feel good about it at all. But I don't know, the kids, another decision. We hadn't been vaccinated. They probably weren't going to vaccinate us without taking us somewhere else, so I just went. In the end, I said, okay, let's just do it.
Sorry?
Can I have your key?
Sorry, I can't hear what you're saying.
Can I have your key? I want a key, please.
Give me a sec, keys. Why, are you going to give me a receipt for these keys?
Yeah.
Mum, it's Mark.
Yeah, all right, mate. You don't have to touch me.
It's Mark from the ambulance.
Come on. Who knows? Who knows? Who knows? No.
This is not a question of telling people they're going to have a shower and then sending them to the gas ovens. This is bringing people into a place for their own good. This is where the vaccine was. This was their best chance of escaping the ravages of this disease, both for themselves and their families. Within that framework, there was great inefficiency, which I regret, but which I think to some extent was inevitable, the result of simple human failure. The policy, having got to that stage, was correct.
5 weeks after the virus had been released in New York, a man fitting the description of the suspect was identified on CCTV footage from the target locations. Between 0754 and 0947 on April the 1st, he was captured on over 20 different cameras. Then he vanished. But on the 40th day of the investigation, an extraordinary discovery was made.
A maintenance worker at a subway station literally tripped over a body that had been tucked into an alcove in a service tunnel. I mean, it was in bad shape. It had been there over 7 weeks. It was decomposing. It was half eaten by rats. But we knew it was him because of the clothes.
The forensic examination concluded that the body was heavily infected with smallpox over a week before the outbreak began. But it wasn't the virus that killed him. The cause of death was an overdose of barbiturates.
He was deliberate, methodical, calculating. I mean, he deliberately infected himself and then infected as many people as possible. I mean, he even tried to hide his body.
Although the killer had taken great care to conceal his identity, the corpse provided the FBI with its first substantial leads.
A body is a mine of information. You can get DNA, you can get dental records, clothing fibers, and indeed, we got good prints from a key that we found in his pocket and a water bottle that was left nearby. And from this, I was convinced that he would turn up on some intelligence file somewhere. I mean, there was money, planning, power, and ruthless conviction behind this. This was a professional hit.
By late May, smallpox epidemics were taking hold in Africa, South America, and Asia.
I was completely devastated because it was back in those same countries that we'd eradicated it from.
One of the worst hit cities was Bombay. Within a week, the number of cases leapt from 3,000 to 18,000. Medical staff were staying away from hospitals, and millions were fleeing the city. No one had ever seen smallpox spread this fast before.
30 years ago, it was a different world. There were 6 million people in 1970 in Bombay living, and in 2000 there were 18 million. Tens of cities had nearly 20 million people living in them now. Mexico City, Sao Paulo, Lagos. What compounded the problem was that in those intervening 20 years, AIDS had become rife in these countries, and that made it doubly horrible.
In many parts of Africa, nearly a quarter of the population were HIV positive. Because of their weakened immunity, smallpox was nearly always fatal.
It's May the 21st, and we've been here a couple of days now. And this is our new home for the next couple of weeks at least, anyway. It's a primary school, which they're using for the quarantine centre. But it's more like a prison. If you see it from the outside, when I first saw it, it was like barbed wire fencing. There's definitely no way out of here. And the vaccine still hasn't come. They said it would be here when we arrived, and it wasn't here the next day, and it isn't here today. And because of all this, people are getting a bit anxious, a bit nervous. So it's starting to get tense.
I'm getting the impression basically you've just been trained and told just to fuck us off and not give any information at all. I think there's something really fishy going on and you're not telling us about it. No, not at all.
We were told it was probably just a delay or that the delivery had gone to the wrong centre, whatever, that it was difficult to get information out. But we were being fed a line as far as I was concerned. We were just being fobbed off. Meanwhile, we had been brought into an environment where after weeks of staying put and trying to protect ourselves and other people, we were suddenly exposed to scores of other people.
Anyone who is sick must report themselves to the medical authorities so that they can get treatment. It is essential that all cases of illness are reported. If you know of anyone who is sick, immediately notify the authorities in your neighborhood. I repeat, anyone who is sick must report themselves to the medical authorities.
As the number of smallpox cases exploded, it became almost impossible to keep track of the epidemic.
If you know of anyone who is sick, immediately notify the
No one was left untouched by the nightmare.
Once again, anyone who is sick must report themselves to the medical authorities so that they...
You had families that were ripped apart. Mothers who had died, children who had died, fathers who had died. You had the whole fabric of the city torn apart.
We were overwhelmed by cases. We were seeing 400, 500 new cases a day, thousands of new cases a week. We just couldn't afford to miss anybody because it would perpetuate the epidemic. And we're constantly under that pressure, constantly.
I mean, we were all exhausted. We were working around the clock, and particularly Sam, because he was out in the field. And, he'd come back to the office and crash, and I just thought he was overtired, that he was, just exhausted from everything that he was having to go through.
But I hadn't taken the measures to protect myself that I should have. And I paid dearly for that.
It's still the 21st, and very, very good news today. We all got our jabs, and believe you me, it looks disgusting, but it's pretty much the most beautiful thing I've ever seen in my life.
Needles, standing. Sean, I'm going to faint. The worst thing is standing in a line like this because there's so many people in front of us. We have to wait and watch.
Since their arrival in quarantine, it had taken 3 days for the Cooper family to receive vaccine.
Don't worry.
It's a huge sense of relief for everyone. People are even starting to smile again. So that's it. We've done what we've come here to do. It's just a question of waiting now till we can go.
No, I don't like this. No.
But it would be another 4 days before anyone knew for sure that the vaccine had taken.
There you go. All right.
All right. Thank you.
The night they brought me to the armory, I was lucid. And I could sense my fear. That's when I was the most afraid, because after all, this was the place we dreaded the most.
How's Mr. Jones doing with his vomiting?
His vital signs are stable.
Okay. He's getting the medication? Have his fevers come down?
A little bit.
Okay, good.
The first thing that hit me was the smell. As soon as the doors opened, you could smell it. It was a mixture of disinfectant and rotting flesh. The night the pustules came, you know, I honestly just wanted to die.
Deep breath.
It was not only painful, it was, well, people would describe it as your skin being on fire, you know. And that's what it was. You just want to rip your flesh off.
These patients did not get the vaccinations at an early enough stage. About 2/3 of the patients do survive, and unfortunately, 1/3 of them pass on. You better call them up.
And more than anything else that I saw, that place brought home the devastation of this epidemic.
In the UK, the management and distribution of vaccine was becoming more efficient. But for many, it was too late.
I'm going to show you once. Once only. There you go.
That is not like mine.
No, yours is...
Mine is well pussy compared to yours.
It did come up.
And Mum's has gone pussy.
Sean, let me have a look.
I've just shown them.
Sean, please let me see it.
Mum, it's not pussy like ours.
Sean, there's nothing there. There's nothing
See it?
Wait. It did come up, but it went back down.
There are about 5 people in the centre, including Sean, who once we'd had this vaccination, didn't have any kind of reaction.
I think we're going to have to repeat the vaccination.
Okay, can we?
The earliest we can do it will be tomorrow.
Okay, can't we get something today?
There's no way.
She said no.
Tomorrow will be okay.
There you go, tomorrow.
Definitely tomorrow, yeah?
I'm sure it's going to be tomorrow. The new batch will come tomorrow. So come and see me tomorrow.
Okay, cool.
Okay. Is that okay?
So I can have a word with you?
Yeah.
Mom, she said everything she's going to say.
By the time it became obvious that Sean hadn't reacted to the vaccine, 10 days possibly since we've been exposed, possibly more.
Wait, what was that? That noise.
What?
There was a noise.
What's wrong?
What's wrong?
Oh my God! Oh God! Let's go it then. I don't know. I woke up and she was getting out of here. She's got Mum, come on. Come on. She gonna be all right.
I was really terrified when I saw this woman being sick that Sean was sick too. I knew she was one of the people who hadn't reacted to the vaccine too. I think I kind of knew. I knew there was something wrong. I didn't see it in Sean, but I just knew it.
By the beginning of June, the vast majority of the planet was caught in a disaster of biblical proportions.
They fled the cities to get away from smallpox. They then had nowhere to go, so they were put in huge refugee camps, which was a breeding ground for the virus anyway, so they might just as well have stayed in the cities. Nobody was farming, nobody was transporting food. There was nothing. The whole infrastructure of these countries had collapsed. Nothing was working. And people were just ravaged by famine, typhoid, dysentery, cholera, plague, you know, everything. It was mitigating against them.
By mid-June 2002, the death toll in the Third World was rising by 200,000 people a week. On day 65, America had over 1 million cases of smallpox. By now, substantial quantities of new vaccine were becoming available, but its management and distribution was fraught with problems.
You have to remember that the health infrastructure was in absolute chaos. Just getting the vaccine to the people who really needed it was a desperately difficult thing. Yet the country was really virtually on its knees by this stage.
But the tide was turning. The combination of harsh containment measures and mass vaccination was reducing the spread of the disease.
By mid-July, we got the figure of 100,000 people infecting 90,000 people. Now, that's a lot of people still being infected, but the number we were looking for is for each person infected, one person or less than one person being infected. And if you think that before that each infected person was infecting 10 or 20 other people, and that was increasing exponentially, 1-to-1 or less than 1-to-1 was a very positive number.
Earlier today, the Mayor's Office of Emergency Management and the New York City Department of Health confirmed that for the first time, the rate of smallpox infection has dropped in the city and will continue to drop. While there is nothing we can do to bring back those we have lost, the containment of this epidemic marks a significant turning point in restoring the calm and prosperity of this city. The last 2 months, I have been giving nothing but bad news. I needed a little break, so I took a walk. I told everybody I was going for a walk, and I just walked. It was a ghost town. I mean, in more ways than one, it was a ghost town. The corner of 42nd Street and Fifth Avenue, you could have shot a cannon in any direction, and you'd have hit no one. It was empty. It's kind of hard to explain, but it made me realize what an incredible loss we had experienced.
Jack had put in about 2,000 telephones into the armory. God bless his soul for doing that. So I could talk to my family and tell them I was all right, and find out that they were okay, which was even more important to me. And I just wouldn't have been able to bear it if I'd infected them. Thank God it didn't happen.
30,000 people died in New York. 1.5 million people died in the United States, but 60 million people died worldwide. Yes, I think if I had been allowed to control the epidemic in this city and deal with the problems that that action initiated, we would have been successful in controlling the epidemic.
Every known fact about the day the epidemic began has been documented in detail. At 07:54 on April the 1st, the killer walked into a grocery store on the corner of Spring and Lafayette. He purchased 2 bottles of water, walked out of the building and onto the subway. At 08:32 in front of Grand Central Station, the killer was seen crossing a crowded intersection, touching 6-year-old Jose Marco Ramirez on the head. He died 22 days later. In a short distance, the killer passed over 150 people, infecting 10 of them. A receipt from a jeweler's found in Mark Smith's wallet placed him at the scene at the time. Smith's was one of those 10.
All he had to do was take a speck, a pinpoint, a sample of this virus, get a lab in his kitchen, a petri dish or a brewery kit, and culture it, infect himself, and there you go, you're a weapon. He made himself into a weapon.
At 08:33, the killer entered the Cosley building and stepped into the elevator. He rode to the top floor, then back down to the lobby, where he exited the building. Cynthia Sheldon then stepped into the elevator.
We didn't find a match, not a single hard piece of evidence that would link him to anybody. The only clue we discovered was a message that he wanted us to discover. The key was the only accessory on his person. Now, he knew eventually that key would lead to a door.
The rent on the apartment had been paid in cash 3 months in advance. On the table lay a copy of the King James Bible. It was open at the book of Ezekiel. A single passage was marked.
A third part of thee shall die with the pestilence, and with famine shall they be consumed in the midst of thee. And a third part of thee shall fall by the sword round about thee. And I will scatter a third part into all the winds, and I will draw out a sword after them. Thus shall my anger be accomplished, and I will cause my fury to rest upon them, and I will be comforted.
Beyond this ambiguous message, the investigation failed to discover a motive for the attack. To this day, no evidence linking the terrorist to a known organization has ever been established. The case remains open.
I lost my son, and I couldn't do anything. I couldn't do anything to help him. It's very difficult to cope with losing somebody, and can just see his name on a piece of paper. Maybe he's still alive, I thought for a long time. Maybe they made a mistake. So I never saw him again.
Outbreaks of smallpox are still occurring in parts of Africa and Asia. A new global eradication program has begun. But the social and psychological wounds of the great smallpox pandemic of 2002 will be much harder to heal.
Any release of smallpox is going to challenge us in a very serious way because this is a continually expanding problem with cases occurring wave after wave after wave. So we have to really be ready to move quickly and effectively with a large amount of vaccine and a large population. I think we're now approaching the point where we're going to be able to do that, but we're not going to be able to prevent all cases no matter what we do.
We try to find a magic bullet, okay? And now, for example, many government officials, they say, okay, guys, if we organize the production of smallpox vaccine as soon as possible, we are going to resolve this problem. It's not a resolution.
We have the possibility of transmissible agents to deal with, like smallpox. We have the whole issue of genetically engineered agents to deal with. And so I think what is opening up now, or should be opening up, is a debate about how we put into place defense against these things, strong defenses in depth, and not just pay lip service to it.
We're going to be better and better and better prepared, but I don't think I'm ever going to be in a position to say confidently, we're well prepared, now we can relax, because I don't think we're ever going to be there.